Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my November wrap up and telling you about everything that I've read in the month of November. So before we get going, as you can see, I'm in a new place. I've got a different background behind me. I mean, it's still my old bookshelf, so it might look pretty similar, but it is a new background. We've now moved, which is exciting, and have a bit more space for books than I had before, so that's very nice too. And yes, new background, slightly new setup. I'm still getting used to the lighting, so I'm sorry if the lighting is less good. The acoustics are different here. I feel like I have a higher ceiling than I did before, so I might also sound different. I'm still getting used to all of that, but we will see. Anyway, today I'm here to tell you about what I read in November. So in November I read 15 books. 3 of them were unpublished things that I read for work. I work in publishing, but that means I have 12 things to talk to you about today. November on BookTube is Nonfiction November, so I read quite a lot of nonfiction, partaking in that readathon, which I always really enjoy. It's hosted by Olive from A Book Olive and several other wonderful booktubers, including Andrea from Infinite Text and Natalie from Curious Reader. I'll link all their details down below. So I read quite a lot of non-fiction this November. In fact, my reading for November is pretty much split. I read 6 fiction books and 6 non-fiction books, which is a lot more non-fiction than I usually read, but I actually really enjoyed some of the things that I've read this month, especially the non-fiction that I listened to on audiobook actually. But I will start off with the fiction, and as usual I will start off with the classics. So one of the things I finished in November was Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. I actually read the bulk of this, or at least the first half to 2/3 of this in October, back in Victober. I was listening to it on audiobook, and it's quite a long book, so it took me a while, but I finished this off towards the beginning of November, and I just love this so much. I love Dickens a lot, obviously. He is my favourite author and I think he's wonderful, and Little Dorrit is my 3rd favourite Dickens novel after Our Mutual Friend and Dombey and Son. I love it so much, and it was so nice to reread and so nice to listen to on audiobook as well, because I hadn't listened to it before, and it just... Dickens works so wonderfully on audiobook. I think his writing style is just so suited to being read aloud. And I hadn't reread Little Dorrit for quite some time. I think this is the 4th time that I read it, and the last time I read it was about 6 or 7 years ago, so it was really, really nice to reread it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Little Dorrit tells the story of a young woman called Amy Dorrit. She has grown up in the Marshalsea prison for debt. Her father was arrested for debt a long time ago before her birth, and she was born in the Marshalsea prison. She has grown up all her life there. Her father has been imprisoned for many, many years. Amy is allowed to leave the prison, but her father is not, and she comes back and lives there to look after him. She's 22 years old at the beginning of the story, and we follow what happens when she meets a man called Arthur Clenham, who's come back from abroad. When he comes back, his life and Amy Dorrit interact, and it follows everything that goes on from there. I love it so much. There are so many things about Little Dorrit I enjoy. One, obviously, is Dickens, so I love his writing style, I love all his many characters, I love all the interweaving plots and everything. But I also really enjoy the way this book looks at money. I think it really fantastically and interestingly looks at class and money. And I also really enjoy Amy Dorrit as a character, and Arthur Clenham as well. I feel like Amy Dorrit is my favourite Dickensian heroine, and Arthur Clenham is my favourite Dickensian hero. And actually, like, I find in a lot of my favourite Dickens novels, it's actually the minor characters who I love most, but in Little Dorrit, yes, I love all the minor characters, but I think, like, the central characters I love more than I usually do in a Dickens book, if you see what I mean. It's just such a good book. I just love it. I love it so much. This month I also read 3 Rival Sisters by Marie-Louise Gagnon. This is a late 19th century French classic. This is a review copy which the publisher Gallic very kindly sent me. They are starting a new series called Revolutionary Women, which I believe is all about publishing slightly forgotten classics from French female writers, which I'm very excited about. I think it looks like a really great series, and I was really excited to read this, which I really enjoyed. So this has sort of a novella and a short story in, or 2 novellas maybe. So the first one is called 3 Rival Sisters, and the second one is called An Atonement, and they were translated from the French by Anna Atkin and Polly McIntosh. I really enjoyed this. I especially enjoyed 3 Rival Sisters. I didn't enjoy An Atonement quite as much. So 3 Rival Sisters is a really interesting novella which tells the story of three sisters and what happens when a kind of suitor comes to town who's interested in marrying one of them for the inheritance that they are expecting to get from their father, and he can't decide between them, and he's a bit kind of fickle and sort of very shallow, thinks very highly of himself, and kind of can't decide which sister he thinks is the best. And one of them is sort of scheming against the other two to try and win his favour, and the other two are sort of quite divided over how they feel about him. It's a really interesting novella. It's quite odd and unusual in a way that I quite enjoyed, and I think it looks interestingly at kind of the options that were open and that weren't open to women in 19th century France, and examines the complexities of that in a really interesting way. I think the way it kind of subverts certain things that were expected of women at that time were quite interesting, but it also kind of didn't subvert them necessarily in the way that I expected. I don't know why, but it reminded me of some Russian classics that I've read, specifically of like short stories by Chekhov and Turgenev, but I don't really know why, and I can't really explain that. But there we go. I really enjoy these. These were quite interesting, and I am definitely going to be picking up something from the rest of the Revolutionary Women series in the future. I also listened to Very Good Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse, which I listened to with my partner Nick. We are working our way slowly through the Jeeves books on audiobook and really enjoying them. I just very much enjoy the Jeeves and Worcester series. They're so silly and such good fun, and they're just kind of a series of little short stories slash episodical narratives telling the story of all of the complicated adventures of Bertie Wooster and his manservant Jeeves. Bertie Wooster is a very upper class gentleman who is not very intelligent, but his man Jeeves is much more intelligent than him and has to kind of solve all his problems for him. It's very entertaining, very silly, and just great fun. Then this month I also finally read The Muse by Jessie Burton, which I've been meaning to read for ages. I read The Miniaturist nearly 2 years ago now, I think, and absolutely adored it, and so I was very excited to get to another book by her. And I really enjoyed this, but I did not enjoy it as much as The Miniaturist. I have kind of quite complicated feelings about this. I would say there were some things about it that I absolutely loved, and there were some things about it that I found fascinating, and there were just a few little problems that I had with it, which meant that it wasn't quite such a standout read as The Miniaturist for me. So The Muse is a dual narrative. It's set half in the 1960s and half in the 1930s. In the 1960s, we're following a young woman called Adele, who is from Trinidad. She's lived in London for a few years. She's been working for a long time in a shoe shop, which is not really what she wants to do with her life. And at the beginning of the book, she is offered a new job as a typist for a sort of gallery and art dealers. And through a series of events to do with her new job and also her new boyfriend, she comes across this mysterious painting. And then in the 1930s, we're following a young woman called Olive, who's an English girl living in Spain just before the Spanish Civil War, and we're following her experience as an artist, her friendship with a male artist who lives nearby, and also how they kind of get caught up in the political events that are going on in Spain at the time. So there are some things that I've really enjoyed about this book. I thought both the storylines were quite interesting, and I liked everything about painting and art. Odell also wants to be a writer, and I liked the way that kind of her writing and her creative writing and Olive's painting are kind of contrasted and compared, and how both of their kind of artistry is limited by the social prejudices that both of them face in their time, which I found really interesting. So there were just a few things that slightly bothered me. So one of them is that Odell's speaking voice and her dialogue is very different from her written word, even though it's in first person in her chapters, which I think is partly because she's supposed to be telling it from far in the future, but I just thought that was a slightly odd decision. And then also the very opening scene of this book I just really didn't like. So basically the very opening of the book is that Odell is working in this shoe shop and a woman comes in and asks to try on some shoes, and this woman doesn't have any toes, and this really freaks Odell out, and that's the opening of the book. It doesn't have any relevance really to the rest of the novel, but I thought it was a weird and slightly unpleasant use of a character's disability to create an atmosphere of tension, basically. I think that's what it's trying to do, and it just didn't really sit right with me, and I didn't think it was very well handled, so that also slightly bothered me. So there were a lot of things that I thought were really good about this book. It was interesting, but I definitely didn't like it as much as The Miniaturist. I then also read The Faculty of Indifference by Guy Ware. This is a really interesting novel. It was quite odd, but I rather enjoyed it. It tells the story of a middle-aged man who works for something called the Faculty, which is basically some kind of secret service. He works for an anti-terrorist organisation, and that means that he can never really speak about his work work, outside of work. And we're basically following him and also the relationship that he has with his son Stephen, who at the beginning of the book is sort of 17, 18, and then we skip halfway through the book 5 years into the future when Stephen's kind of coming back from university. The main character, Robert, his wife died when Stephen was just a very small child, and so they've always their family has just been the two of them, and they have a slightly strained relationship, especially because sort of Robert can never talk to his son about his work, which is such a big part of his life. And the book is basically about their relationship, and some of the book follows Robert in his working life, and some of the book is kind of journal entries from Stephen, who is writing about his life, but also is kind of writing a novel that is an imaginary version of his grandfather's life. His grandfather also worked for the faculty, which is quite surreal and strange. There are many things that I enjoyed about this. I think the writing is really great throughout, and I really liked the way this book looks at work and how mundane so much of work is, but also when Robert's work is not mundane, it's really bad, and that kind of exploration of some of the very difficult things that he has to deal with at his job were really well done. But I also just really loved the relationship between Robert and his son Stephen and how that was developed. I thought it was really, really interesting and really nicely done. I feel like I've read quite a lot of books about mothers' relationship with their children, but I don't actually think I've read that many books that look at fathers' relationships with their children. So I found that really interesting and was just something I really enjoyed. So yeah, I enjoyed this one. It was a bit different and I would highly recommend it. And finally, on the fiction, this month I also listened to Some Kind of Wonderful by Giovanna Fletcher. This is a commercial women's fiction novel and one that I really enjoyed. I have heard a lot about Giovanna Fletcher, but I'd never read any of her books before, and actually I basically picked up this one because my library had it on overdrive and I was looking for a new audiobook. And actually I hadn't heard as much about Some Kind of Wonderful as I have about some of her other commercial women's fiction. And I think because what I'd heard about her other novels is that they are kind of quite conventional rom-coms and quite conventional love stories. Some Kind of Wonderful wasn't really what I was expecting, and I really, really enjoyed that. So this novel follows a woman called Lizzie. She's 28 years old, and at the very beginning of the book, her and her boyfriend of 10 years break up because she wants to get married and kind of have this new life, and he just isn't so sure anymore. And basically the novel looks at her trying to work out who she is without him, because they've been together since she was 18 and she doesn't have an adult version of herself without him. And it's just about her kind of rediscovering who she is as a person and learning to have a life without him and learning what she wants for herself rather than just for them as a couple, which I really, really enjoyed. I thought it was just a really interesting novel about, identity, family, friendship, self-discovery and so many other things like that, which I really enjoyed. It's good fun, it's funny, it was very readable, and I just really thoroughly enjoyed it. So that's all the fiction that I read in November. So now let's move on to the non-fiction. I have 6 books to talk about. So one of the non-fiction books that I read for non-fiction November was this. This is A Brief History of Life in Victorian Britain by Michael Patterson. So now, I have many thoughts about this book. I thought I would start with this one because it is the non-fiction book that I got on with the least this month. I have many, many problems with this book. So there were some things about it that were really interesting. There were some interesting chapters, there were some interesting things in this book, but it is not what it says on the tin. This is not a brief history of life in Victorian Britain. It is not a social history of Queen Victoria's reign. It is not a social history. It is not a history of life in Victorian Britain. If you were to rename this A Brief History of Victorian Britain or A Brief History of Middle-Class Life in Victorian Britain, you might just about get away with it, but this is not a social history. There were some interesting chapters in this and there were some interesting things, but I don't think you can have a social history of Victorian Britain and barely talk about education, barely talk about marriage, barely talk about gender roles, barely talk about class. There's a little bit about class, there's not very much about class. It doesn't really talk about urbanisation and the difference in life between rural and urban areas. There's just so many really important big social structures and social issues that are just not talked about in here. And I get that it's a really short book, but it spends 30 pages on what the Victorians ate and doesn't talk about Victorian family structures at all. That doesn't seem quite right to me. It's also a very middle class history, I would say. There is a chapter that does talk about people below the middle classes, but most of this book is about life in Victorian Britain for the middle classes, mostly the urban middle classes. There's a chapter on The Office which talks about working in an office, but it doesn't really address working experiences for anyone else apart from people who work in the office. So it doesn't talk about servants, it doesn't talk about people working in factories or on farms, just doesn't really address a lot of the things that I would expect a book that claims to be a social history of Victorian Britain to address. So that's one of the big issues that I have. And then the other issue I did have is that there were just some things that I disagreed with. The book's kind of portrayal of the whole Victorian period is pretty rose-tinted. Michael Patterson writes quite fondly of the British Empire and goes to quite great lengths to try and say that workhouses really weren't that bad. So there were quite a few things where I just disagree with his historical stance and his interpretation of events. But then there were also some things he was talking about which were just wrong. At one point he's talking about how Queen Victoria wore black from her husband's death to the end of her life, and he just says, well, that was normal. And that wasn't that normal. And yes, some widows did wear black always, but actually a lot of widows wore black for a year and then moved into sort of half mourning and wore sort of white and mauve and other colours, and he just kind of says no, it was completely normal. And actually I don't think that's true. And then another part he talks about kind of respectability and the cult of respectability as being something which was kind of middle class people idolising aristocratic people, and that's definitely not what respectability was. Actually a lot of middle class respectability was really set at odds against the upper classes, saying, you know, look at the aristocracy, they drink so much, they're behaving in a very different way. A lot of middle class respectability was setting itself up in opposition to upper class kind of immorality as it was perceived at the time. So there were quite a few things where I just really didn't think that what he was saying was right. So I had many issues with this. It was, however, quite interesting to read, and it reminded me that I really enjoy reading history books, because even when I don't agree with them, I find them really interesting to pick apart and argue against. So it has made me think that I should read a lot more history books, especially about the Victorian period, because I know stuff about it already. So that's kind of a mixed reading experience. It was interesting, but yes, I would not recommend this. I really would not. If you want to know about life in Victorian Britain, I would recommend How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. This is definitely a much better book. Sorry for that very long rant. Moving on to the other non-fiction that I read in November, which I will probably have less to say about. I also read Reading Lolita in Tehran by Asna Nafisi, which I've been meaning to read for ages, and this was a really interesting read. It is a memoir from a woman who was a professor of literature, who's from Iran and was working in Iran just around the time of the Iranian Revolution. And it looks at her experience teaching Western literature as Western literature was becoming increasingly censored and banned. It's a really, really interesting book. I think the way she writes about literature and also the way that she writes about her experiences being a woman at this particular point in time were really, really interesting. And in many ways I really enjoyed this. I think the content was fascinating. I didn't love the writing style, and at times I found it a little bit too lyrical for me, maybe, I'm not sure. I found it a really interesting read, but I found the writing a little bit hard to get through at times. Just something about the style didn't quite gel with me. So I found this really, really interesting, but it wasn't one of my absolute favourites of the month. Another book I enjoyed but didn't fully fall in love with was this. This is Anthony Powell by Hilary Sperling. This is a biography of the author Anthony Powell, who is an author who I really enjoy. It's an interesting book about his life. It's a pretty straightforward biography in many ways, and there was a lot in it that I found interesting. I think my favourite passages were the bits where Hilary Sperling is writing about Anthony Powell's writing and his books. I haven't read all of his books, and there are definitely more of his books that I want to read that I have been kind of inspired to pick up more because of this. I also really enjoyed the bits about Anthony Powell's relationship with other writers. He was friends with George Orwell and Evelyn Waugh, and learning about kind of their friendships and their relationships were really, really interesting. However, in times I did find it a little bit of a slog and a little bit dry. I think especially because a lot of the time there's just a lot of names and just a lot of names of a lot of different people that he knew. And I think maybe this is just because I haven't read that many biographies. And actually when I think of other biographies that I have read, such as biographies I've read of like Jane Austen or Queen Victoria, I knew a bit more about them before I went into them, or they're biographies that are structured in a slightly different way. Like I really enjoy biographies written by Lucy Worsley because I think she does quite interesting things with biography in terms of the way she structures them. But this is a very like straightforward conventional biography, and at times I just found it a little bit dry. Actually, one of my favourite bits of the whole book, a bit that I really, really loved, was the afterward, where Hilary Spurling talks about her relationship with Anthony Powell, because they were actually friends, which I didn't know. They met when he was working as a kind of book reviewer and she was working as a journalist, and they kind of became friends and got to know each other. And she, you know, the afterwards, she's just talking about her friendship with him and her relationship with him, which I just loved. And I kind of wish I could read a memoir by Hilary Spurling about her friendship with Anthony Powell and how she got to know him and know more about him, rather than a very straightforward biography. I think I would like that more, but I think that's just me. So if you're very into Anthony Powell, it's an interesting read, but it is a little bit dry in places. But I'm glad I read it because it's nice to know more about him. And like I said, that afterward was really, really lovely, and that I found really touching and moving, more so than the rest of it. So there we go. I also read Bookworm by Lucy Mangan this month. This is a memoir of childhood reading, and so it's basically about the journalist Lucy Mangan looking back on her childhood and the books that she read. I really enjoyed this. It's really good fun, and it was really interesting to hear about all the books that made Lucy's childhood. She is sort of 15, 20 years older than me, I think, and so not all of her childhood books are my childhood books, as it were, but there were a few books that she's talking about that I am familiar with, and I really like the way that she writes about reading and her love of reading in her childhood, and how that kind of changed over her childhood was something that I really enjoyed. This was very readable and good fun. I will say that I think it could have been shorter, or at least I really enjoyed the first half, and then in the second half I kind of felt like I'd not got everything out of the book that I was going to get out of it, but I think I didn't need it to be as long as it is. I also wonder if that's because like my childhood reading experiences were more similar to hers than my teenage reading experiences were to hers, because I got massively into classics as a teenager. So I wonder if that's also maybe why I didn't like the second half of the book as much when she's talking about her reading as an older child. I don't know. It was an interesting read, but like halfway through I was like, I love this is a 5-star book. And then by the end of it I was like, no, it's a 4-star book, it's not a 5-star book. So anyway, that's beside the point. Moving on to my two favourite non-fiction books of the month, two of my favourite books of the year actually, both of which were really fantastic, both of which I listened to on audiobook, both of which were just amazing history books. So yes, I'm excited to talk about these two. The first one is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which just, yeah, this book was so good. One of my favourite non-fiction books I've ever read. Probably coming in at second after What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen. It was so good. My favourite history book I've read, I think, ever. Gonna go out and say that. It was just, yeah, just exactly what I love in a history book. So The Five is a sort of history book, but also slightly a true crime book, but not really a true crime book, which looks at the 5 women who were the victims of Jack the Ripper. But rather than looking at their murders and looking at Jack the Ripper and who he was, instead it just looks at these 5 women and their lives. And basically the book is split into 5 sections, and in these 5 sections Hallie Rubenhold just follows these women from their childhood until the point that they were killed, talking about their lives and the complexities of their lives, the struggles of their lives, the deep poverty most of them were in, you know, their family troubles, their troubles with addiction and poverty. She picks apart the myth that all of the victims of Jack the Ripper were prostitutes, and she shines a light in a fantastic way on the position of women in the Victorian period, especially the crippling poverty that many women had to undergo. She explores gender and social mobility and family. She explores both respectability and kind of a desire to break convention. She looks at how many people were kind of left behind and forgotten about by Victorian society, people who really were the underclass, who didn't have any income, who slept rough a lot of the time. The lives of some of these women are just truly fascinating and truly heartbreaking, and it's just brilliant. And you know what I love about The Five, which is what I love, it's my favourite thing in a history book, when a history book takes a small thing or one person's life or a few people's lives and uses it to look at a society as a whole. I just love that, and that's what this book is. Hallie Rubenhold is using these 5 women's lives to explore the whole of the Victorian period, and it's just so good. It's just so good. It was so good. Highly, highly recommend The Five. You need to read it, everybody. If you have any interest in the Victorian period, pick it up. It's so good. Then I also listened to Black and British, A Forgotten History by David Olusoga, which was another fantastic history book. This is a really, really fantastic eye-opening book that I would highly, highly recommend. It is a history book which looks at the history of Black people in Britain and Britain's relationship with Africa and the Caribbean from sort of the Roman period up until the 20th century. I would say the focus of the book is mostly on 18th and 19th century Black British history, but it does look at either side as well. And basically throughout the book, David Olusoga is looking at the presence of Black people in Britain and also Britain and the British Empire's relationship with Africa. Britain's involvement first in the slave trade, then in the abolition of the slave trade, and then in everything that follows. It's a really, really fantastic book. It's so well written and it's so easy to follow. Like, I listened to an audiobook. The audiobook is 22 hours and I really thought I would not finish it in November. I thought I'd still be listening to it in December, and I just absolutely flew through it. I listened to it in like 10 days because it was just so fascinating, and I just kept wanting to read on because it was so interesting. I really liked how there is a really fantastic mix in it of social history, political history, economic history, cultural history. Like, he looks at Black British history from all angles possible, really, which I thought was fantastic and really interesting and something that I really enjoyed. Obviously, my special interest being in the 19th century, I found his chapters on 19th century Black British history really, really fascinating. And I think he really brilliantly writes about and explores the kind of complexities of 19th century British racism and how a country could be so anti-slavery but also so racist at the same time. Because it is quite hard to look at how a country could be very anti-slavery but also use its like mission to destroy the slave trade as a like way to gain imperial power in different places. Like, there's so many complexities and contradictions and kind of hypocrisies within 19th century thought around race. And I think he explores that in a really complicated, really, really interesting way, but also a way that's really straightforward to understand when you're listening to the book. And another thing he talks about, which I thought was fascinating, and we don't talk about enough, is how, like, I think a lot of people like to try and look at history as a straightforward progression. And I think especially when we look at prejudice, basically, and a history of prejudice, we like to see it as a straightforward line upwards from lots of prejudice to less prejudice. And actually the way he looks at, especially in the 19th century, how, you know, in the 1830s and 1840s, Britain was much more welcoming to Black people coming from Africa or the Caribbean than they were in the 1870s and 80s, and how kind of late 19th century Britain was much more racist than mid 19th century Britain is really, really interesting to learn about and really fantastically written about. In general, this is just a really fantastic history book and one that I would highly recommend. The one thing I will say is that I wish the book had been longer, and I wish that it had gone into as much depth about the 20th century as it had about the 19th century, and I get why it doesn't. Like, I think part of the point of this book is that, as David Olusoga says, like, a lot of Black British history, as it's taught in schools and as it's spoken about, starts in like the 1940s. You know, there's this sort of idea in British culture that Britain became a multicultural country in the 1940s, and before then everyone was just white, which is not true, which is what the book is about. But I think because David Olusoga is sort of writing in response to other histories and saying, look at the massive Black British history before that point, and before the 20th century especially, it means that actually there's a lot less about the 20th century than there is about the 18th and 19th century. Basically, what I'm saying is that it was such a good history book that I just wanted even more of it, because it was truly fascinating and just, yeah, brilliantly written, really, really interesting. If you have any interest in history whatsoever, and to be honest, even if you don't, you should read this, because it is just a brilliant, brilliant book. So that's it. Those are all the books that I read in November. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, longer than I feel like I should have done for the amount of books I've read, so I'm sorry if this video has been eternally long, but there we go. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, or if there's any that you'd like to get to in the future. And that's it for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.